So a lot of people came here because you were advertised as someone who was, first of all, as you, which was a part of the reason a lot of people came, but also because you were going to be talking about controlling negative emotions. So you started by talking about a list of characteristics that made me kind of relax. Okay, that's good. If our children had all of those characteristics and we could imbue that in them somehow, that's a good thing. But for some reason, you chose to talk about controlling negative emotions. So tell us what you mean by that title.
Well, I think negative emotions can be everything from anger, if it directs you in the wrong way. And again, I want to be clear that in just situations, oppression deserves anger. But if you just wallow in anger or let the anger take control, the injustice is not going to go away. You may be able to strike out. You may actually be able to feel better in the short run because you did something. But if the injustice doesn't go away, you've done nothing. So that's an example of a negative emotion. But let's also think about somebody who has learned that they can't do certain things, and they persuaded themselves to do it. I sometimes forget things. I never travel without leaving something at home, and I travel 2 or 3 times a week. And I actually thought when I was dressing tonight that I had left my nice shirt here as opposed to the shirt I slept in the last hotel. And I did it because it was not where I thought it was. And my own learned helplessness came in, so my first response was, I did it. And I actually called up to find out where I could buy a shirt. I looked to see if I could iron the shirt so it could look nice. And then after I got done with those negative emotions, I let my rational mind get back in control. And I said, why don't we go back? You might, and remember where you put the shirts? And lo and behold, I had been so neat. I had been the precise opposite of what that learned helplessness was.
Nice shirt, by the way.
Thank you very much, yeah. Okay. I said it so you could say that, okay? I attended a real interesting set of talks last year at the University of Pittsburgh's School of Education. They were celebrating their 100th anniversary and brought some of us in to talk about motivation. I was talking about the conditions that support motivation. The thing I learned most was from some guy who was talking about, watch kids with skateboards, and do they get, do they fall? Yeah. Does that stop them? No. Why, when we have kids in school, that their experience of the inability to do a test satisfactorily becomes something that drives them away? Now, part of it is skateboarding is a lot more fun. But part of it is also we get negative emotions. We learn to feel that we can't do certain things.
And I guess negative emotions are, what I'm hearing you say is that they're just a natural part of life. And in 2006, when I was in a dialogue with the Dalai Lama, one of the young people who was in dialogue with him, a 13-year-old, said, do you ever get angry? Is angry okay? And the Dalai Lama said, of course I get angry. But it disappears quickly. Gotcha. And it doesn't just disappear. I'm sure that there's a strategy that's involved there. What I'm hearing you say is that somehow you've learned, in the example with your shirt, how not to let that negative reaction emotion shade the rest of your evening, the rest of the next day, and that isn't just temperament, that you actually learned some skills, which is what you're talking about.
And if we think about what I could have learned, let's go back to the self-disclosure up there. I might never have gotten to the point that I do it, but I do it less ably than I should. What we want is for young people, as well as older people, to be self-aware enough about themselves not to let a negative reaction gain control, even if it's for a wasted minute. Now, wasting a minute is a lot less than getting stuck on wasting an hour.
Yeah.
But the more we enable young people to understand themselves and also handle the way in which they react. The basic, a basic paradigm in social emotional learning is stopping and thinking before you react. Did I stop and think before I reacted? No. I reacted, I wasted time, and then I came back and I thought, I came up with the option, I checked it out, and I succeeded. And I was no different than the David Osher who would always start answering questions on tests even though they said, read the back first.
Yeah.
Okay? That can be changed. My own tendency may be neurobiologically to be impulsive, but it doesn't mean that you can't learn to manage your impulsivity.
Yeah, my dad used to say about me, when all else fails, read the directions, because you got to try everything else first. So three of the things that we're going to really talk about tonight, then, as we start to really dig into the how of all of this, is emotions, managing your own emotions, as we're talking about, also managing relationships, and also talk a little bit more about this thing that you're calling cultural competence. How do we deal with differences? So let's start with the social and emotional competency, or just the thing that we call understanding and managing our emotions. Okay. Is this something that we can learn? You're saying yes.
Yeah. It's also something we all learn. The question is how well we learn it and how much that learning affects our ability to do tasks. How we learn it is both a product of whether or not we're taught it, and we might be taught it at home, we might be taught it in school, we might be taught it in the community. I think ideally we're taught it in all places. But also how we do it, even if we learn to do it, is also culturally appropriate as well. And so in some cultures, it may mean that I express my emotions very, very differently than in other cultures. And so there's no normative way of handling the specifics, but there is a way in every culture that we help people become more competent. And being more competent is being able to handle those things that go on inside our body that affect our ability to perform, to make decisions. And
one of the things that you've said, you've pointed to is self-awareness, so this awareness of emotions. You'd think that is something that people would just take for granted, that's important, and something that a child actually can be fostered in a child. They can learn to be more self-aware. But people actually aren't, I've discovered. They don't think about how would you help a child become more aware of their emotions. So can you start to answer that question for us? What are some ways that you can do that?
Sure.
Or help yourself, for that matter.
And while I'm doing it, even though we're not going to ask the audience, just think amongst yourselves what you do with young people whom you are with, whether as parents, as uncles, as aunts, as friends. Because I think we often do it sometime. We often do it at least in an ad hoc way.
Like how?
Well, I think that we do it when we ask a child how she feels. We do it if we are watching a movie or a TV program with a child and we ask them about their reaction. That ability to ask somebody to describe their feeling, to name their feeling, is part of a process of helping people do it. Now, not every child has access to adults who do that.
Right.
And that can be a product of a lot of different things. It can be a product of the fact that adults may not know that that is something that they should do because when they were growing up, they don't recall anyone doing it. It may be that adults would want to do it, but can't do it. And that can be for a lot of reasons. It can be because of the fact that they're working 2-3 jobs. It could be because they're incarcerated. I don't know the data in Western Canada. Again, I've studied for that Human Rights Commission testimony, the data on disparities in Eastern Canada where they're huge. And the chances of an African Canadian person being locked up and not being available to her child is different than the chances of a Caucasian Canadian person. I mean, just not being next to your kid means that you're not going to be able to be there. So it's not just knowledge. It's not just what we learned when we were growing up. It's also the conditions under which we operate that give us the ability to do things.
But it is possible, too, that as the adult in the child's life, you actually can't name your own emotions.
That's right.
I mean, as an interviewer, it's not unusual to interview someone and ask them, how did you feel? And to see the eyes just go vague because they don't know how they felt.
Yeah. If we use Mark Brackett's mood meter, and I said, how's your daily mood? I should ask you that first.
Yeah. Well, so this is has anybody ever seen these flip charts with emos on them? So you've seen that, okay. So my adult son gave this to me because he had one and thought it was really useful. And the idea here is that when I'm sitting in my office at home and I'm just living my life in my office, which is where I usually am, and I'm feeling something, and I'm not even aware that I'm feeling something. It's just something's happening. Right. If I pull this thing out and I flip through the pages until I feel the word that I'm feeling, there's cranky. Okay. Somehow just finding that word, putting it back in front of me and looking at it does something to calm me down.
That's right.
Not only that, when my husband comes in the room, this is real. He'll look at that and say, okay then, and turn around, as opposed to thinking that what he's seeing is that I'm mad at him.
Yeah.
This is the room, this is what's happening in here. If you don't want us, then don't come in the room.
So let's use this as an example, and let's situate this in a city like Cleveland that I described before, because they're using the PATHS program, and if you remember, we had up there the faces.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very similar process. So you have lots of kids in Cleveland who have individually experienced more or less emotionally teaching at home for reasons that relate to both the skills and dispositions of the key adults around them, as well as the conditions under which the adults operate and the supports for adults to be with kids and not be someplace else. They now come to a school, and what the school is doing is giving them the opportunity universally to do that. And it means, and the teacher's doing it as well. So I don't know if the teacher ever has a cranky out. I would not want to have it.
Right?
Okay, I knew that they were. But what they are doing daily, and since kids can change the cards during the day more than daily, is developing the habit of becoming aware of your feeling as well as the experience of naming it, which, as you say, gives control.
Why? Explain that link.
Well, I don't know the science behind that link myself, okay? So that I would not want to venture into it. I just know from reading other people's work that the power of being able to conceptually wrap around a feeling and be able to describe it and bound it by giving it a name gives you cognitive control. I'm now already speculating here, so I want to be clear, which I think in itself reduces some of the stress you are feeling that relates to a variety of thoughts that are rushing through you and a variety of emotions.
I should tell you that I was with a 4-year-old on the weekend, and she found this, and we flipped through it, every single one. There are many pages. She was 4 years old, And she recognized some of them are a little more difficult. She didn't name these apathetic, but she knew. And then she had my iPad and she was taking pictures. And when she left, I realized what she had done is sat this in front of her.
Wow.
And replicated the face, took a picture, flipped it over, took a picture. That's a 4-year-old. Yeah. So that said to me that it can be a game, it can be fun, but there's something about that as being foundational to the rest of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite children's books when my oldest son was growing up was Alexander and the Terrible Good, Hard, Very Rotten Day. And right, it's about the fact that all days aren't nice. And it's a powerful metaphor. But all of us have days like that, hopefully not as bad as Alexander's day, and the ability for children to understand that is important. But again, the ability to name it, the ability to bound it, and to be able to deal with it yourself. And so let's go back, though, to the PATHS program for a second, because I do know PATHS well, even if I can't, if I don't know the science behind naming. That the PATHS program is well designed because it's not just giving young people the ability to name it, it's also giving people tools to gain control when your emotions, let's say here negative emotions, are likely to be taking over. And so I talked before about stopping and thinking. PATHS talks about stopping and thinking, and for young kids, it has a model. The model is being a turtle, is a turtle. And so when your emotions are taking control, it could be you're angry, it could be you're scared. What you do, like the turtle, is you go inside your shell. And then when you're able to get control, and part of getting control is naming that emotion and thinking about how that emotion might affect the decision you're making. And obviously, the older you get, the more sophisticated you can be about understanding how anger might drive you in one way and fear might drive you in another way. But once you gain control, you can then think about what are positive options, and then you come out of your shell. And what can go ahead.
And how do the children react to that?
They use it. They do the turtle. And teachers use it, and they can talk about it. And while we have collected good quantitative data as good scientists to demonstrate the fact that overall in the district, doing PATHS really has affected kids' behavior, what's just as compelling is the stories that we hear about kids who have moved from school to school, and there's a lot of poverty in Cleveland, and about 1/3 of the kids move at least once or twice during a year. A kid arrives at a new school, and the kid is becoming emotional in a negative way, and the adults there help the child go through the turtle.
It's really, when you think about that, why is it that we just assume that people just learn that people just learn how to control their emotions, when you're talking about an explicit, a deliberate strategy that you're describing it in a classroom, but there's no reason a grandparent or a parent couldn't use the same strategy.
Precisely.
What happened all those generations ago when we didn't have social emotional learning?
Well, I think if we go multiple generations ago, we're dealing with very, very different contexts.
Okay.
People actually had more time to be together. I don't want to romanticize a good or a bad time, because all times are good and all time has had their challenges. But people had more time to be together. In lots of cases, not all cases, people also were in environments where they were surrounded by other kin who were also available. And people knew that the place where young people would learn some of these things were at home, so perhaps they did do it explicitly. And I think successful parents often do it explicitly. And again, It's based on knowing what you should do and having the ability to do that, which itself is a function of both your own social emotional competency, because maybe I know what I should do, but I'm dealing with a child who's hard to deal with. And if I'm not in control of my emotions, then I'll let my anger or my frustration prevent me from staying in the game as an adult and teaching that young person.
So there are examples of schools, I think you mentioned it earlier, where it's not about just about teaching the children how to develop these competencies. It's about the adult themselves having one of these on their desk and learning. Because you said yourself earlier, I heard you say you're continuing to learn, or you're continuing to teach yourself. What does that mean?
Well, I hope for everybody, I certainly for myself, that I learn every day, and it's very, very important for me to learn. And I learn from both reflecting on myself, and I also try to practice from what I'm learning. Okay, so my big success over the last half year is that as somebody who used to blow steam when I was caught in traffic and when people were stupid and weren't starting as quickly as they could, and I'd get rid of the steam quickly, but I also know that that's not good for me, and it's also not productive, and so I've taught myself instead to take a deep breath whenever I'm caught in traffic and someone is doing something that might frustrate me. And what has happened much more quickly than I thought, is that a pattern of behavior has developed, so I no longer have to tell myself to do it. I just do it.
How quickly?
How quick? Almost immediately.
Really?
So if you're in front of me and you're doing a stupid thing, I'm doing a deep breath already. And it really has worked, okay? And so one can do it.
Yeah. And I suppose if there was a child in the back seat, they'd be learning something just from being there.
Yeah, well, the answer is yes. And if I were self-reflective about it, not indulgently self-reflective, but self-reflective, it's even more likely that that child in the back seat might learn about it.
What do you mean?
I think, let me unpack a series of questions you've asked, because they're all rich and good.
Good.
That if we want kids to learn social emotional skills, we don't just want to provide them with a set of experiences. We want them to be interacting with adults who can model the same behaviors and reinforce the experiences that the young people have. And so I think teacher social emotional competency is very important. It's important to learning social skills. It's also important to the role set that teachers play. And if you want later, we can talk about that. Part of how a teacher can help a young person learn is by being self-reflective. You know, I could have gotten frustrated when Maria did this, but I didn't. But if you think about everyone's patience, but including a young child's patient or an adolescent's patience, if every time David's doing something, he's also explaining to me why he's doing it, I'm going to tune him out. It's all about David. And so what teachers have to be able to always find are those teachable moments. And there are enough of them. And so one ought to be reflective, but one can't be obsessively reflective. Okay?
Yeah, but it is a piece of the puzzle to talk about it out loud occasionally.
Yeah. You know that when I used to teach a lot, I had an image that goes back to the early 60s of a cartoon that took place at a time when people didn't have computers or calculators that they used, but used slide rules. And it was a teacher who was teaching somebody and said, "It is obvious that," and then said, "It is obvious that." Then they walked out of the room and came back about an hour later and said, "It is obvious that," and they wrote the answer on and went on. That's not good teaching. Good teaching is to also help the learner know when you're struggling with things and to unpack that process. And at the same time, one has to be a good enough reflective practitioner to know how frequently one does that so that people don't get stuck in your own self-reflection.
Yeah. And especially when it's related to emotions, I think.
Yes, yeah. And if you think about the fact that if it's related to emotions and you're also emotionally involved, if you're not in control of your emotions, it's much harder to be a reflective practitioner because your emotions are getting in your way and you're not as nimble and reflective in that practice.
Yeah.
So it's really important for teachers to be able to be in a place where they are in control themselves.
And parents?
Oh, parents, very, very much so. And everybody who are what sociologists call natural raters, and also who perform gatekeeping functions. You know,
They call them what? Natural
raters. Raters. I rate you.
Raters. Oh.
Yes, yeah. It's my great New York City accent to hear, okay? That,
I had a vision of somebody rating. And
yes, well, grading, well, in terms of rating, we make decisions about people that are often decisions for people. And our reaction to them, think about implicit bias, but our reaction to it when we're just not aware of how our own anger is getting in the way affects their outcomes. And so, for example, and I don't know the data for Canada, I know the data consistently for the US, where there is a major problem of kids being removed from school through suspensions. And if you look at what is the modal, what is the dominant reason kids are removed from school for suspensions, it's for dissing adults.
Dissing, putting down adults.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's the adults' emotions getting in the way. It's not for carrying a weapon. It's not for doing something else. It's for dissing adults. And I have done research a decade and a half ago regarding kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, and found through interviews that we did with policemen and with judges and people who were running juvenile facilities that kids got in deeper and deeper because of the fact that they could not control their own anger, and at the same time, the adults who were responding to them let the kids' anger trigger a response for them that was more punitive.
And I wonder if there's I mean, this is probably what you're saying, that that adult in that scenario isn't even aware sometimes that it's anger that's being triggered because it's a rule. It's a rule, as opposed to acknowledging that they're being triggered.
So let's go back to the castle circle and the names and being self-aware, whether it's self-aware as a young person or self-aware as an adult, is in part being aware that you have emotions. Let's go back to the Dalai Lama story. Right? It's not that you're angry, the anger can go away. It's not that you're not angry, but you're not going to let the anger that you feel control the decision that you're making. And when you are in a position where you can make a decision that can affect the life course of somebody, am I going to divert this person, get them some counseling, or am I going to send them to some type of lockup?
Yeah, it is a different way of thinking too about children. I've thought of how tolerant we are when a child is learning something to read, like how to read or how to walk. But if they're clumsy emotionally or socially, we punish them pretty quickly.
That's right.
And I think that probably comes from us not understanding that this is developmental, this is something that we develop over time, and that we need help to learn it.
I think that what you are describing is part of an even bigger picture where issues that involve mental health and mental wellness, emotional health and emotional wellness, are seen as being owned by the individual, and the individual is blamed for them. Whereas if there is a physical need, people see that as not is experienced by the individual, but say, with the exception if they've done something like, having rode a motorbike without having a helmet and got a head injury, they're not seen as being the responsible person for the injury. And that leads to public policy that treats people differently. I do not know what it's like in Canada, but in the US, it used to be, and I don't think it has changed a lot, about 1/3 of kids, I should say in 1/3 of the states, young people who were poor, who needed mental health services, could only get them if their parents gave up the rights to be parents temporarily to the child welfare system. Now, no one would ask the same thing if a person had a broken ankle. And so to get back to your example right now, when we see somebody who is emotionally clumsy, we don't react to it in the same way as we see somebody who's struggling to read.
And will that come as we become more aware of how we learn emotions, how we learn relationships?
Well, I think we know enough already about relationships. I think that it will become more frequent if this becomes a part of the intentional, explicit curriculum of schools. It can become part of people's own lives with their children if we are more explicit as a society about how important it is, and help people become not just emotionally literate as human beings, but also literate about the process of emotional literacy, which lets them know that it is not something that just runs a natural course. Just like other forms of literacy, it can be cultivated, it can be coached, it can be supported, it can be scaffolded.
Yeah, that's the key. In fact, you said earlier that you want to be in a place where people not only want to be good, but they know how to be good. And I thought that was pretty profound, you know, that they know how to build that. And in British Columbia, we actually are, as far as our curriculum goes and our school goes, I think in many ways we're a model, because we did have social responsibility and social and emotional learning. So, and teachers who are here, I'm sure, and other teachers have told us that they still want to know more about how than the how do you do it. So we've talked a lot about the emotional awareness. So this is awareness of your own emotions and how to manage your own emotions. And the second part that you wanted to talk about is understanding and managing our relationships then. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you know, I think that let me start with some work that we have done over the past 2 years. I lead a contract with what in the United States is called the Interagency Working Group on Youth. It's 10 big federal departments and 2 agencies, Department of Education and Justice and things like that, that have been mandated to work together to create a common website, and we have a great website, but also to develop a strategic plan for youth, ages 10 through 24. And for the Interagency Working Group, we conducted across the country what were called listening sessions, where we brought lots of people in coming from different disciplines to talk about what's needed. And what people said over and over and over again is relationships are more important than programs. And what they were saying is something that we know. There's a great educator in the US named James Comer, who's a psychologist at Yale. And Jim Comer once said that relationship in education is like location in real estate. Okay? That if we think about our own lives, we are so interdependent with other people. And so developing relational skills so that we can work together more productively, that we can help each other and we can protect each other is huge. And you know, we all do it, you know, all of us muddy through it and we do a pretty decent job. But I would say all, if we look at, say, data from the US, which again I know better, when half of the marriages in the United States end in divorce, that would suggest that it's pretty tough to be married. but also there are real pressures on people, because when people get married, they're not getting married because they think they're going to get divorced. When we think about the extent to which either people leave jobs because of the fact that they can't handle the social pressures, or they're not being supported, or stay at jobs that they feel imprisoned in because they really don't like being there, not just because of the nature of the task, but because of the people with whom they're working, but they can't leave because they don't have other options. Again, that talks about how critical relationships are. And so we really need to be able to provide people with the opportunities to develop relationships. And I was talking to somebody before we began, who was in the audience, who said, can this be done in the family? And in a lot of what we've been talking about so far can be done in the family.
Like, you mean explicitly and deliberately?
In terms of emotions.
Yeah.
But when you get to relationships, families are not, even though now families are much more diverse, but families still don't reflect the diversity of people, the diversity of personalities, the diversity of cultures that one is going to interact with in the real world. And school ideally becomes a place where that can happen. When Horace Mann, who was one of the famous educators in the US who pushed for compulsory education in the first half of the 19th century, called for education, public education, he talked about a place where the sons and the daughters of the rich and the poor could be together in the same space. And while it was partially ideology and partially hopeful, I think his notion that there are some public spaces where we can come together and we can learn to do things together is very important. And you can't just do that at home.
I'd like to spend some time talking about that group where there are different people, and that's a good place to learn how to do that. But are there not some foundational things in terms of relationships that happen at home before they get into the school?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, first of all, the relationship that takes place between an infant and a toddler and those people who are closest to him or her are huge. And we know that they affect and can compromise, if they're not healthy, a child's ability to interact with other people in huge ways. And it can be everything from becoming aversive to other people to being overly open in a very risky and dangerous way to people. So relationship skills do start at home. And home is a nurturing place as well as a hothouse for really developing them, not just when children are young, but also later on as well.
What do you mean a hothouse?
Well, it's a hothouse both because of the fact that on the one hand things can become much more intense, and on the other hand, it is just as in a hothouse, it's in that intensity, if things can be worked out well, that they can become more fixed in terms of people's own development.
So if you stay with that, then as an environment that could nurture healthy relationships, what are the ingredients in that environment that really matter? This is now the home.
Okay. Well, let me say something to frame it, first of all. Whenever I analyze situations, I think that there are two things that interact that produce a capacity to do something. In this case, let's say we want to talk about the capacity to develop young people who have good relational skills. It's both what I know, so it's my own competence if I'm a parent, but it's also the conditions under which I operate. And I keep on coming back to that because everyone is not in the same circumstances. And so the ability of parents to do things is not just based on their own competence, which includes knowing what it's like to what I should do as a parent. It's also my emotional competence. It's not getting frustrated. It's not getting burnt out. It's being able to handle stress. Those are individual things that affect what I do in that hothouse. But what also affects me, what I do in that hothouse, is everything else that's going on. It includes how many children do I have? It includes how much control do I have over my life, which may be a function of the job. It may be a function of other things that are going on. So it's in that combination of people who have competencies that realize those competencies under particular conditions that we get the capacity to really develop young people in a healthy way, or the lack of that capacity. There are two basic ways that we often teach social emotional competencies. One is very direct, and in school we may do it with a curriculum. I think that is less powerful, this is my own intellectual bias, than doing it in a way that is nested in environments that provide the opportunity to do it, as long as you can do it consistently and persistently. And home does provide a way for parents, if they have the knowledge and support, an opportunity to do that, to help young people learn relationships. And parents, try very, very hard to do that. If it's a child and is a single child and the child's frustrated, trying to help the child handle the frustration. If the child's frustrated by an experience that she's had with a peer, to try to help the child process it. If one has two siblings, or if a child has come over, that becomes a natural opportunity to help young people do that. China has an interesting experiment going on right now because of the fact that because of the one-child policy. It was aimed at birth control, it was aimed at population control, but as a function of the one-child policy, kids don't have siblings. Go out a generation, kids are not going to have cousins. That absent people living in communities where peers are interacting with lots of other people, it's going to be much harder in a home situation to do some of those relational things than it is in the Canada or in the United States, where people might have multiple children.
I'm just even thinking about the challenges that you laid out for us when you started talking tonight, just about because you've described it as a scenario in the house or in the school. You have the child themselves, and then you have the parent and what they bring to it. But then you have the pool they're swimming in, the pressures they feel, so those pressures that you listed there, such as things are so much more rushed, for example. I don't think there's a parent alive who doesn't feel kind of guilty about that, and worry about their ability to teach their children these competencies to help them be kind and good people, because that ingredient is toxic in so many cases. What's your thinking about that?
Say a little more. I'm not sure what the question
is, or that list of challenges that you listed that we're dealing with every single day as parents. If you're a great parent, you have a lot of competencies and your child's okay, but you're rushed, you're always rushed because of the reality. You're not there, you can't sit down for meals together. How strong is that a negative force up against the other forces? How toxic can that be?
Well, there are a range of children in terms of the needs that children have for greater levels of attention from parents. And that can include what we know for a long time, that kids are different in terms of the developmental needs. It's also possible from research that's now being done to suggest that some people are particularly responsive to both toxicities in their environments and also nurture and supportive conditions in their environments. But I think we have to start by thinking about the fact that every child does not need the same amount of support from a parent. But that being said, parents are in a situation in the United States, and I think in Canada as well, and say not in a place like Scandinavia where there is public policy that has really tried to create more time for parents and kids and things like that, where it is very, very hard to spend quality time with the child. And it's both because of the parents' situation and the job demands that are on them. It also is probably a product of what the child is doing and whether or not the child is ready as well. I mean, our society has evolved so that if everybody is, and I'm no, this is not my area of expertise, but if everybody has their technology next to them, and I watch all my grandkids and I watch every other kid who's on their held and doing things when they're very, very young and very, very engaged in that. When they are engaged in that process, they are not available for the parent who may be available at that moment. So it's not just how much time does the parent have, but whether or not the parent can make the time so that they can be available in those rare moments that the child is ready, that are really teachable.
And you can see the whites of their eyes.
Yeah. And so the problem is not just the amount of time to be with the child, it's the ability to be there when you are needed. And that's probably the greater challenge right now.
Yeah. When you think then of the school setting, so we've stayed now with the family, now they're in the school. It was a very interesting idea that you're saying that that's the place where they'll encounter difference, maybe for the first time, and a lot of difference now, which actually helps to move us also into the third area that you wanted to talk about, which is this idea of cultural competence. So developing relationships in that setting, what do we need to know about that?
Well, let's do a bridge first, okay? And I want to give something, a way that people could see it if they want. People should go to a website called Edutopia if you've never gone there. Think about utopia and put edu in front of it, EDU. George Lucas's foundation created, I think, Star Wars, okay? And go on it and go see, do a search for teaching math as a social activity. And what you'll see is a really gifted 5th grade teacher who is using class norms that students developed in a class meeting, a good social emotional learning technique that was part of the school. But then kids doing mathematics where some kids are working together and others are observing in a fishbowl. And the kids are solving problems in their own way. And then the 5th graders are facilitated in a process where they're saying, Maria, why did you do it that way? And Maria says, I did it that way because of that. And you can watch the kids learn to feel comfortable challenging each other a little, but then learning that, there might be another way of solving this. And part of learning relationships is learning that there is a universe that's out there that's bigger than your own.
And how do you learn that?
Well, you learn it experientially. Now, you also learn it through other things. You learn it through stories that you read, or oral, if we go back generations, stories that are told. I mean, there are lots of things you learn it, but you can learn it in school, and you can learn it from different people.
But the role of the teacher in that setting you're describing, you have these children, talking about solving their math problem, and part of the learning is what would the role of the teacher be?
Well, he facilitated that process. He set the stage, set it up. He did a brilliant job of letting people know what the expectations were. He was there. You could see him at a certain point pushing a child here, saying, why don't you move over there? He was doing the subtle direction, but what the students were aware of was not that scaffold that he was providing. They were aware of what they were learning from each other. And if you do it once and you don't do it again, that's going to fade. But if that's part of the class, that's very, very different. So before I think the cultural issues are really important, because those are harder things for us to bridge. Those are often more emotionally volatile things for us to deal with. But learning about difference takes place in any environment where we have enough people to create diversity. So even if everyone looks the same, there probably is diversity amongst them.
I'm just thinking about that setting, a school setting, and you know, doing math together and seemingly solving a math problem. And then I'm thinking about bullying. And in the same,
Sure.
Does that kind of an activity help keep bullying from happening in that school? Because it seems like you're doing math, but really you're learning
sure.
about differences.
Well, I would think in that school, the class meeting would be a piece of what would help with bullying before we get to the math activity. But so let's say one of the things that we want to have happen in classes that can help prevent bullying and other forms of unhelpful behaviors is people seeing themselves as members of a community, as people learning about each other, as whole people, or at least as whole people. Class meetings, like the one that I believe preceded, that set the norms, can be a place where a teacher can facilitate a discussion to work out conflicts that have happened. So you have something like that before, but now let's look at what was happening in that exercise that was scaffolded, was supported ably by the teacher, is if people are having good experiences working together, it's more likely that they might befriend each other outside of school or outside of that situation. And that in itself is protective a little against somebody being bullied, because it tends to be vulnerable singletons who are bullied rather than other people. And perhaps, hopefully, also the child who might be a bully would be less likely. I'm not convinced of that latter point.
So people wouldn't have thought of that as in any way as being bully prevention.
And I don't think alone it is. I mean, I think, let me go, I know you're interested, and I think people here are interested in bully prevention. So let's talk a little about bully prevention. Okay. We know a lot about effective bully prevention programs, and they can do a decent job. There was a systematic review done of good bullying programs, and the findings were that essentially they reduced bullying by about 20%. And so let's frame it. Let's think of a school of 1,000 kids, and you have 300 kids who, in the U.S., about 30% of kids experience bullying. Okay, so what we have is we're going to reduce it from 30% to 300 kids to 260 kids. That's good if you are in that group of 60. It's not so good if you're in the remaining 240. And at least what some of us think is that you want bullying prevention programs because you still want people to intervene when they see bullying. You want people to know what bullying is like so that they don't do it. And at the same time, you want to have things like that experience, like the class meetings, because you want to do other things universally so that you create a nicer climate, a nicer environment, so that it's less likely that kids are going to be bullying. But I think doing those other things is not necessarily going to prevent people from being bullying. So I think you need to both address bullying as well as do things that build school communities and that build the social and emotional competence of kids. But together they really help. Some bully prevention programs really work on bystanders and try to tell bystanders what their role is. If you think about my point about not only knowing what's the right thing to do, but the ability to do it, social emotional learning can give you an underpinning so that not only do I know that my job is to be the person who intervenes when I see it, but I know how to do it. And I can do it in a skillful way. Okay, so so I think it's important to know that social emotional learning can contribute a lot to preventing bullying. But if you don't address bullying, I don't think you're going to make bullying go away. And at the same time, if you're addressing bullying without doing things that are building kids' social emotional competencies, then you are also not going to make bullying get away. And you know, the last time I was in Vancouver, I was commenting on a paper that I think Kim, if she's over there, did, and with some of her colleagues. And what was interesting in that paper was the fact that girls who were bullied but were supported by their social networks did not act in the same way as young women who were bullied but didn't have that protection afterwards. So that while you don't want people to be victimized, you also want people to have support.
What kind of support?
You're going to have to ask Kim that. I only looked at the data, but that I think it's social support. It is, and I imagine what it is everything from people saying providing a shoulder to cry on, to people helping you redirect your feelings and things like that, but not feeling alone, and not feeling that you as bad about the humiliation that you feel. That the process of being bullied is often experienced by victims as being a very singular, individual, isolating experience. And if you can have people who can support you, that can help. That's not as good as preventing the bullying. But we're not going to make bullying go away momentarily, and therefore there are a lot of things that can be done both in terms of building the social and emotional competencies of kids, but also creating class and school communities that are supportive, that reduce the likelihood of bullying, that make it more likely that kids will respond positively to intervene when bullying is going on, and also make it more likely that after the event, the kid who is bullied will not be isolated and stigmatized, but will be embraced. Yeah.
We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but I do want to ask you this. How do you build that community?
Well, I think...
That's an easy one, right?
Yeah. Well, you build it intentionally. You build it by modeling it, and you build it by scaffolding it. And I think any of the half of the people in this room who are teachers know that one of the things you do in the classroom, if you're an effective classroom teacher, is you try to build a classroom community. And are there any principals here? No? Or heads or whatever it is? Well, any admit it? Anyway, that... No. And I think good principals know that part of their role is to try to do it as well. And so community is something you have to work at. It's also something that you can build. And we live in a world that people not only have a need for community, but can really respond to it. But you have to work at it. And you also have to support it knowing that everyone will not be able to participate in the community in the same way, that you have to do things to equalize the playing field.
What do you mean?
Okay, let me give you an example. I do some work with the Special Olympics, and with a part of the Special Olympics that's called Project Unify, which is an attempt to take the model of the Special Olympics and apply it to schools to build inclusive school communities. And one of the things that I think we are learning there is that if you really want to create conditions where young people with intellectual disabilities can participate as full members of the community, you have to give them the time to participate. You may need to give them some support to participate. But they can participate. But if you just say, we're going to have an equal playing field and we're going to treat everybody the same, you may formally treat everybody the same, but experientially everyone's not going to be the same, and you're not going to be having that community. So community in part is about all of us being the same. We are a community. It's also about us embracing the fact that we're all not the same. We're different. Each of us has strengths. Each of us has needs. If you remember, one of the definitions of social awareness was the ability to understand the similarities, but also the differences amongst us, and to be able to handle that.
And as long as you don't take the people that are different from you and separate them into a whole other part of the school, then you don't really have a community, do you?
That's right, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a great educator named Paulo Freire, who's famous for being an adult educator, but early in his life and then near the end of his career in Brazil, he was also an educator of younger people. And one of the things that he talked about is the process of humanizing. And I think what community can do when it embraces diversity and when we support people in embracing that diversity is to help each of us grow, to go back to the heart. And so one of the reasons you want community in schools is so that people themselves can be humanized, that they can be enriched by the diversity, that they can learn by the fact that Maria solves that math problem in a way that I wouldn't.
It's not
because I'm much more linear. Well, that's because you're borderline. That's what I read now, okay?
Actually, that's a terrible one to leave open.
That's right, all right. So,
overstimulated.
All right, I hope this was the case.
All right,
okay,
any questions? Shall
right.
we start? I'm sure people have specific questions.
Sure.
Hi, David. Thanks for your talk tonight. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Roots of Empathy
Yes,
program.
yeah.
And if so, if you'd like to share any thoughts, comments, reflections on that
sure.
program.
I don't know the research very, very fully, so I'm not now coming from the research. Okay, what I've read, I've liked. Okay, but I've not done the type of systematic review of it in my own head that lets me speak with great confidence. But I like the program a lot. I was talking to someone about it a few days ago and saying that it is a program that I would really think about bringing into schools. And I like it for a bunch of reasons. I like it because it really does seem to be doing something from what I've read in terms of really building people's compassion, building their empathy, and I think that's really important. I also like it because I think it also may start to create the conditions within schools where people who are later going to parent start to even earlier think about that in much richer ways than the ways they used to, here's this egg that you're going to have to hold for a week. I mean, it's not just a technical exercise. I mean, what it's about in a persistent and consistent manner is something that seems to me to be able to develop an aspect of kids that we would want to develop. Okay, so I hope that, as I said, from what I know, I like it. The people I know whom have used it have reported very good things about it, but I have not systematically reviewed it myself. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you for that question.
So just building on, building on that question, a lot of what you talked about today was controlling emotions, sort of educating the heart by teaching the mind to dominate it, which I don't think is really what we want, right? Like Dr. Spock is not the ideal we're after here. And what the question that was asked was about teaching people to feel emotions, which is another aspect of educating the heart. So I just wonder if you could talk about it seems to me that there is an inherent danger in intellectualizing your emotions, metacognitively being aware, drawing them inside, mastering them before you come out of your turtle shell, that you'll have the emotional range of a dead fish. So how do we avoid that
Yeah.
excessive intellectualization and actually teach people to be emotional?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think that my training is not as a psychologist, and so when I am coming to what you're talking about there, I would imagine that for people who are particularly not in touch with their emotions and repressed with their emotions, that you need to do more things to draw them out than just give them opportunities to express how they feel. Because what I was talking about today already is for people who are able to talk about their emotions, feeling their emotions. It's not just about controlling. It's being aware of them. But let me be clear about the bias that I bring to this. And it's not just my own intellectual bias. Maybe I am too much of a rationalist. Some people might say that. But in addition, the concerns that I have had as problematics, as intellectual concerns that have really affected research that I've done over the last 4 decades are, what are the conditions under which people can work together more effectively? Now, within it, the issue of compassion is very, very real. I both as a practitioner as well as a student, I really believe hugely in people sharing how they feel. Okay, that when I do workshops, we always end up by having 2 talking circles. And the first one is a rational one, where I say, let's go around the room and I want to build a collective synthesis, and you can't repeat each other, but let's together analyze what we had. And then the second part is I say, okay, we've now done that, now we go to the heart. I want each of us to go around and talk about how we feel, share it, and make a commitment to each other. That stuff's huge to me. But let me again go to bias, though, because there really is. I'm a product of the late 50s who worked very, very hard in the 60s in the US, and I really, in retrospect, and even felt then in part, that our balance between individual need and collective responsibility was out of whack. Okay, that we really believed that just taking care of ourselves and feeling better was more important than doing those things we needed to do to make a juster world. And so the bias I bring is an intellectual bias, okay? But it's not about not feeling. I think we need to hugely, deeply, emotionally feel, and at the same time, and it's within my own personal bias, we have to also be aware enough of what we're doing so our own feelings don't hurt other people and rather help other people. And I'm not saying you're not saying that, but I just want to be clear, that's where I come about cognitive control. It's not that you shouldn't feel, I think you need to deeply feel. I think we want to provide opportunities for people to feel. Roots of empathy is one example. It's the literature we choose is important. It's how we debrief when there are situations where people get hurt that are very important. And at the same time, I do think that one needs to reflect about it. And so let me just, if that's okay, let me add, there is a movement right now which is, on the one hand, good to really start honoring in education what people call non-cognitive processes. And on the one hand, that's very, very good. And at the same time, some of us are concerned not with that, what's happening, but the label, because a lot of what social emotional learning is not non-cognitive. Mm-hmm. It is the connection of the cognitive with the heart. And so I'd say, my own sense is you want it to be in balance, but I really I'm open to be, from other people here to educate me more, because I may just be too much of the rationalist.
Thank you. I want to come back to the skateboard
Okay, good.
and ask about the relationship of play to emotion.
Sure.
When my grandson plays his computer games, he experiences frustration, and sometimes he keeps at it, sometimes he doesn't, but there are no consequences. When you talk about emotional relationships, or you talk about emotions in schools, it's hard for there not to be stakes.
Yeah.
And maybe there should always be stakes in some sense. But I'm wondering if you know of or think it would be interesting to have programs that were specifically around playing with emotions.
I suspect so. And again, I won't say it again. Remember, folks, you brought in someone who hopefully is knowledgeable and knows a lot about things. I am one person in the world of SEL who's not trained as a psychologist. And so I always want to stick to what I know and what I don't know. But that's not, I'm going to give you the answer, but I have to at least give that, I'm not a lawyer, whatever it is. Okay. Caveat, okay. I think, I want to start in a weird way. That I was very involved at the end of the 90s and the beginning of this millennium in the responses to the school shootings that took place in the United States in the 1990s. I led some of those efforts. And I saw some of the videotapes of kids who had perpetrated things. And one of the things we know is that many of them had been bullied. And that's one of the reasons people got concerned with bullying. But what I also saw were, at least I think in 2 different cases, definitely one I remember, a kid who really said, I play all these games, and people get up after they're killed. And this is a kid who was already going to do life. I mean, this was not, he wasn't telling a lie right here. And that has stuck with me because of the fact that, I watch my own grandkids get very, very involved in the games. And when there are no stakes, I think there's certain things that you can't learn. And so I think where you're going, I think, is a potentially important arena. I think doing it really has to be done with a level of deliberateness to make sure that we don't get kids into trouble in terms of it. But I think that it is possible. And I do know that there are people who are interested in social emotional learning who right now are thinking about how one can use the current technologies to really be able to do what you're talking about. And so I think it can be done. I think it has to be done in an intentional way to make sure that we're not setting the stage for a different type of problem. Because of the fact that all of this takes place in the kid's own private world.
We have another question up. No? One down here then.
Yeah, okay.
Hello, I have a question about the social and emotional learning, social and emotional competencies of the parents. And so if we look at the Scandinavian or other models where the it's normal for parents to stay home for extended months with their kids. Is there any data with longitudinal follow-up comparing if the parent has high SEC, I guess you call it social and emotional competence, versus low? Because there are some studies in the States that in many cases the kids are actually far better in group care than with the parents. And so do you know if there's any long-term data comparing parent competencies?
I think there are a bunch of things that are involved in your question, so let me try to unpack it, and if I'm unpacking it inappropriately, you have to tell me, okay? That the reason why I think the public policy in Scandinavia that gives more leave for both fathers and mothers is important is to really enhance the bond. It's not about the competency of parents. It's about the bond between children and parents. Now, if I remember correctly, Scandinavian public policy, however, does a lot more to give parents training before they become parents, and I believe, though I'm not sure, maybe continue to support them afterwards. But I think it's important to distinguish between what I called before when I was talking to Maria, condition. Am I with my kid enough time so that we can really develop a bond? And particularly think about dads in gendered societies who often are less able to develop the bond if they're more home and they're really doing it, not out playing football or something like that. That's different from what are the competencies that parents have. And those competencies, as I said before, are really both a combination of their own social, emotional competency. How do you handle a whining baby if you happen to have a baby that's whining? And if you don't have support? That's a social, emotional competency, along with the fact that I know this is what I should do. But there's the social, emotional competency as well as the knowledge competency. Because of those complications, I'm not sure that the good question that you're asking has really been studied yet. That's my guess. Because I think you have to get rid of these different confounds to really be able to get at it. I think what could be done, and maybe there have been studies, it's not been something I've looked at, is one could do something like provide training to parents before they become parents, and not, I wouldn't want to deny it, but figure out some way that you compare it to where parents didn't get the training and where you gave both sets of parents equal support, and then you could see what the differences are. And maybe that type of study has been done. Okay?
Well, we've come to the end of our time together,
Okay.
but before I let you go, I'd love to know, is there anything that you'd like to make sure that we leave here tonight with? What is the takeaway message for us that you hope that we come away with?
All right. Well, so let's start with that hard question that the gentleman over on the right asked me, okay? Emotions, first of all, in a certain sense, I was asked, and we wanted to talk about negative emotions. Emotions are good things. I want to be very, very clear about that in the takeaway. Emotions are what bond us to each other. Emotions can also fuel our efforts at making things better. That can even include, as I said before, anger at injustice. So the issue here is not to become dispassionate. The issue is to be able to be strategic so that your passion, which hopefully is in the right direction, can be effective. And the reason you want to do that is we don't just want to feel compassion for each other. If we really feel for each other and we're bound to each other, then what we want to be able to do is to work together so that we can enjoy life together, and I can enjoy the way you enjoy life and not be in a world where you're experiencing bad things. And that we do it both for those whom we can look at, like in this room if the lights weren't like this, but also we develop a compassion for people who we can't see, who also live in a world where there is a lot of injustice that ought to be rectified, and that requires our ability to work with other people. We can't do it alone to address that, and our ability to find ways so that we are working with other people and not for other people to make that world more just. And so I thank you for coming today.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.